Before I start, just know that I'm gonna spoil the entire first season of House of the Dragon, but since it's been over half a year and I'm very late in talking about this show, I'm gonna assume it's okay. I wanted to make a video sharing my thoughts since I'm a big fan of the Song of Ice and Fire universe and of Game of Thrones, the TV show, before its unfortunate fall from grace. I started out watching the show around when season 3 came out, and in between the release of subsequent seasons, I started reading the A Song of Ice and Fire book series, as well as other stories written by George R. R. Martin, and I was instantly hooked on the world he created. But besides his talent for world building and storytelling, Martin is very adept at exploring a variety of themes in his stories. You see it very clearly in his short stories, where the excess of plot and context is stripped away and you're left with very raw deliberations on a specific topic that, despite their insights, don't take away from the narrative's flow. George's short stories in Westeros and Essos allow him the opportunity to employ his most famous universe to craft different types of stories with different scopes and shine a more focused light on certain themes he is most keen to explore. And you see that in the story of the Dance of the Dragons as well. Regarding what's been adapted to the show House of the Dragon, I have read the original Princess and the Queen, but nothing else, namely the Rogue Prince, Heirs of the Dragon, or the assembled Fire and Blood version, which is the version now being adapted to the show. That said, I have done research on the story as a whole and have a firm grasp of the essential plot points. Despite the letdown that were the final seasons of Game of Thrones, I was actually excited for the release of this new show. Not only because I like George's writing, of course, but especially because, truthfully, Princess and the Queen is my favorite work of his. Not because of how intricately he wrote the plot or the characters of the story, I actually think on that the book is a bit lacking, but where George really succeeds is in his masterful exploration of his revisited theme of war, both its true nature and its true consequences. I have never seen anyone write war quite like George does, and its chaos and futility are on full display in The Princess and the Queen, and that's what I was most excited to see on screen. Not only that, but I knew that this story, unlike A Song of Ice and Fire, is thankfully finished, so I was relieved to know that we wouldn't run out of material, leading to lackluster attempts to drive the plot to the end. So today I'll be looking at the first season of the show, in how it adapted this first part of the Dance of the Dragons, both in terms of character and plot, but also the overarching themes. I will refrain, of course, from discussing what is likely to happen in future seasons that I already am aware of from the source material. Looking at Season 1 as a whole, it's important to establish that what was adapted mostly draws from the original Rogue Prince, or rather, the Rogue Prince section of Fire and Blood, which involved all of the time jumps the writers famously had to deal with, going from Emma Aaron's death in the pilot all the way to the dance at Storm's End in the finale. This created a big challenge in adapting, since the show had to cover around 20 years of narrative in the span of only 10 episodes. I think this was done with mixed results. Overall, the narratives carry over mostly well enough from moment to moment, and individual scenes and individual episodes are crafted very proficiently within their own confines. However, the flow of characterization and motivation does not hold up very well to scrutiny. Characters in this show take very dramatic shifts in personality over time, and we don't get much time with them in a given moment before we're thrown a few more years ahead, and they're even more different than they were before. The ultimate consequence is that while there are standout moments and episodes within the season, the episodes themselves don't connect very well with each other. Ultimately, I am satisfied with the end result. I think it's a very faithful adaptation of the source material, which is not an easy achievement. Where it falters is in its development of the characters and plot over 20 years of narrative, and at how it tries to deviate from Fire and Blood at certain points in ways that don't always work. I'll go over what I liked about the show first, before delving into my own grievances with certain aspects of the production. They're almost exclusively focused on storytelling and characterization, but there are other small issues that do warrant some discussion. I'll begin by saying that the presentation is of stellar quality, as expected. Sets are beautiful, physical locations are stunning, costumes, music, sound design, special effects, they're all firing on all cylinders. The acting is a key element that really pushes the quality of the show up a fair bit. Not everyone is doing an exceptional job, but there are no weak links in this cast, and the best performances really elevate the material. Standouts are Paddy Considine as King Viserys, who gives the best performance of the show, but Matt Smith is also very engaging as Daemon, portraying him with a captivating charisma that owns whatever scene he's in, even when his characterization is not the most consistent. Emma Darcy and Olivia Cooke give very imposing performances as Rhaenyra and Alicent respectively. Despite being a bit mismatched with their younger versions, they retain their presences, especially when the more dramatic scenes call for it. It's also a bit unfair to Cooke and Darcy that Millie Alcock and Emily Carey, who portray the younger versions of Rhaenyra and Alicent, that they give very strong introductions to the younger versions of the characters, and also that they are written quite differently, especially where Alicent is concerned. I saw in interviews that the actresses had little interaction with each other leading up to how they played the characters, and I wonder whether having them align the natures of Rhaenyra and Alicent would have benefited the consistency of their characters. The rest of the actors are just as competent, with some in cases being so visually striking in their looks and attitudes that they either become instantly iconic or rather really fit how I envisioned them when reading. There's also plenty of compelling direction here, and certain cinematic choices really elevate specific moments. One such example is in episode 6, where we're reintroduced to Rhaenyra and Alicent just as Rhaenyra gives birth to her third son and is immediately called upon by the queen, who wants to examine the newborn baby, quite spitefully. This sequence is shot continuously, and the actors physically go from one end of the set to the other. By the time Rhaenyra reaches Alicent, Emma Darcy has been in character giving birth and talking with Laenor for almost 10 minutes, as opposed to Olivia Cooke, who comes fresh into the scene. It's a very clever way to make the actors physically feel what the characters are experiencing, and establishes the power dynamics of the scene, besides being visually engaging. Not all episodes are equally creative and engaging in their direction, but like the acting, I find no lackluster direction to speak of. I have to say though, the infamous lighting issues persist here, like in Game of Thrones. I don't know if this is Miguel Sapochnik's influence or just a widespread cinematic decision, but certain sequences in this show remain just too dark, and not just in battle scenes. This is minimized if you watch the show in a dimly lit room or at night, but I really wish they fixed this issue, because it's an element that makes details in the scenes hard to grasp or pay close attention to, because we, the audience, are just distracted by how hard the elements on screen are to see. Thankfully, unlike the long night in Game of Thrones, the one dragon fight of the season we actually get in episode 10 is well lit and fairly well shot, with more than just shaky close-up shots of the characters. We get wide, longer shots of the dragons moving, we know where they are in relation with each other, their movements are natural and fitting for their respective physicalities, and the proper lighting is achieved with the inclusion of the lightning and the storm. The rain helps foggy up the scene to save a bit on the CGI, but it doesn't detract from how fluidly the sequence comes across. It's honestly better than any dragon action sequence in Game of Thrones, save maybe Spoils of War. I know it's incredibly expensive to put this on screen, and the show pays, in other ways, for spending this much money on these small moments, but I have to commend them for just being able to have these moments at all, with $15 million per episode, when, by comparison, Rings of Power had 4 times the budget per episode and never presented anything this jaw-dropping. The story itself is handled in a mostly functional way, save for a few exceptions, which I'll get to. I believe the first half of the season is pretty well handled in how it relates to the main plot within the confines of King's Landing. King Viserys I faces a crisis of succession, beginning with the death of his wife, Emma, which connects with his need to remarry and the widespread dislike of his brother Daemon among the court, as well as a few other personal grievances, which all lead to his unprecedented anointment of his daughter Rhaenyra as his heir, and all that is pretty well depicted. It makes sense that Viserys would appoint Rhaenyra, and it makes sense that he would stick with that decision even after having a son with his second wife. He feels a fatherly responsibility to honor the oath to Rhaenyra, as well as a need to repair the wrongdoing done to his cousin Rhaenys, who had a better claim to the throne than him, but was passed over given her gender, as well as a penance for what happened to Rhaenyra's mother, Aemma. This contrasts well with the plot given to Rhaenyra herself, who is thrust into a position of having to deal with being an unmarried heir apparent princess who must shoulder a responsibility that many people do not want her to have. Rhaenyra is well presented early on as an ambitious girl who actually enjoys the freedom her station as princess and heir gives her at first, before realizing that there is not much freedom to be had as a member of the royal family, especially being a woman. Rhaenyra's conflict is contrasted by the character of Alicent, who starts as Rhaenyra's best friend, but she's groomed by her father Otto to abide by the tenets of Westerosi society, and to play the titular Game of Thrones, rather than seeking to escape it, like Rhaenyra does. This leads to her marrying Viserys as her father desires, firmly securing the High Tower's position and power within court, and driving her away from Rhaenyra, who comes to resent Alicent for marrying her father and providing him with sons that may come before her in succession. At the same time, Alicent resents Rhaenyra for her reckless attitude towards courtly duties, her dishonesty regarding her affair with Criston Cole, and Rhaenyra's general nature of caring only for what she wants, whereas Alicent believes in fulfilling her perceived role as a woman, even at the expense of her personal happiness. For Alicent, Rhaenyra gets to do what she wants, and she's entitled to her desires without having to live as a noble lady is expected to live, whereas Alicent gave up on that to do what was expected of her, marrying a man she did not really want to marry. She herself puts it best in this scene.
What have I done but what was expected of me? Forever upholding the kingdom, the family, the law. Will you flout it all to do as you please?
Alicent, let her go!
Where is duty? Where is sacrifice? It's trampled under your pretty foot again.
Release the blade, Alicent.
Daemon is our last protagonist, and he is, admittedly, a bit all over the place. He's presented as an ambitious man who longs for power and influence. He resents his brother for changing the succession laws to make Rhaenyra heir rather than him, and afterwards he becomes a bit lost, which the show sometimes struggles with depicting. The egg incident is nothing more than a meaningless side plot of Daemon throwing a tantrum, before finding some purpose in the War of the Stepstones, which is also a bit of a meaningless conflict, shown just to present the region as a relevant location for the plot. Upon returning to King's Landing, he seems to become interested in courting Rhaenyra, whether because he is attracted to her, or because he only seeks to take the throne by her side as king consort, we really can't say at that point. He is expelled by Viserys for this, and after attending Rhaenyra's wedding, he decides to marry Laena Velaryon, and then he lives in Pentos with her for a whole of 10 years. He could go back to King's Landing, as Otto is not Hand of the King anymore, but that doesn't seem to be his desire anymore, for some reason. Even Viserys offers him a place at court at Laena's funeral, and he refuses. Maybe he really did love Rhaenyra. It's only after they plot the fake murder of Laenor that Daemon gets what he wants, to be with Rhaenyra, and then he is fully invested in her ascension, but by then, he seems a completely different character. He wants a place of power in court, but then he doesn't. He could be with Rhaenyra as a lover for 10 years, but he chooses not to. Then he seemingly gets what he wanted most of all, to be with her, and in the middle of all of this, he murders his wife in cold blood. I get that it can be interesting to present Daemon as a complicated, fickle character, hard to grasp, difficult to predict. That's an aspect George really likes about Daemon as one of his favorite characters. However, the show makes a point, unlike the book, to shed some light on the actions that we are not sure that Daemon really did in the book. Turns out he really did say the heir for a day joke. He certainly doesn't deny it. He really did kill his wife. He really did seduce his niece. The show sheds light on Daemon's actions, but not his motivations, because we never understand truly what it is that Daemon wants. The writers cannot change much of what happens, or are unwilling to deviate far from the source material, which I understand, but they could provide a clearer reason as to why Daemon goes from A to B, from resented prince to idiotic egg thief, to niece seducer, to wife murderer, to detached family man, to staunch niece lover and defender, and in the finale all the way to wife strangler. All of that said, to be fair, Daemon is very entertaining to watch. I was doubtful of Matt Smith, but despite not always liking the snarky grins Daemon seems to have in every scene, Smith really carries with him a very charismatic and imposing aura. Daemon is the coolest, and he knows it. People fear him, and he knows it. And Smith really sells that well. I already talked about how the basis for the whole plot is tied around Viserys and his succession, but it would be remiss of me not to reiterate that Viserys is, inarguably, the best character of the show. Despite being the shallowest of the characters in the source material, Viserys is given here great depth, and a beautiful tragic arc as the flawed king who is desperately trying his very best and failing miserably. Joy, hope, naivety, confusion, insecurity, rage, and deep despair. Paddy Considine and the writers bring all of those to the screen gloriously, making Viserys the character who actually is the most consistent from episode to episode. He's the one who suffers the least jarring changes in motivation or characterization. His growth is tied with every element of the plot, which keeps him constantly relevant until his death. Viserys is this show's greatest triumph, and I was very sad to see him go. I am convinced the show is off to a promising start for season 2, but I have to admit, the hole Considine leaves on this series will be a hard one to fill. While Viserys' struggle is the most compelling to watch, it isn't without its missteps, and now I'll move on to some of the narrative issues I believe the show suffers from. Like I said, Viserys' motivation for standing by his decision to name Rhaenyra as heir are well established and maintained, and that by itself would be enough. However, the writers decided to reinforce this by including the prophecy of Ice and Fire regarding the White Walkers, that Viserys is hell-bent on passing on to Rhaenyra, and only Rhaenyra for some reason, entrusting her to keep the realm together in order to battle the coming threat. Now, even though the characters don't know when or even if the White Walkers will reappear, we, the audience, do know. We know that this prophecy will have no bearing on this story, since we've seen Game of Thrones, so it only matters in how the characters interpret it and act on it, and prophecy-based decisions in a story often can cheapen real drama and human character motivations, and the same is true here. In addition, it's weird that he's so steadfast in only telling Rhaenyra about this, given that it really doesn't hurt to share it with other people. Not even Daemon was made aware of this prophecy, and he was Viserys' heir for what we can assume worth 14 years. This is the first big mistake of the show narrative-wise, because it relegates the characters' decisions to divine premonitions that we know will have no bearing on the actual story, and it shifts the true discussion away from the relevant themes of power, greed, ambition, and the oppression of women. Characters fight over the Iron Throne because they believe they're the chosen ones, and not because they're greedy or power-hungry. Rhaenyra argues with Daemon all the way in episode 10 about keeping the realm together and avoiding war, and she mostly uses the argument of a united realm being the only thing that can stop the threat in the north, and not because she wants to avoid needless bloodshed or the death of her family, for example, which would be more grounded motivations. He, thankfully, tells her that putting stock into such things is just plain stupid, while choking her, admittedly, but he makes a fair point regardless. The other narrative clutch the writers rely on at least twice this season to critical effects regards Misunderstandings. If you've seen the season to the end, you know what I mean. The writers have Rhaenyra and Alicent seemingly reconcile in episode 8, only for Viserys to talk about Aegon the Conqueror's prophecy to Alicent, thinking he's talking to Rhaenyra, leading to her thinking that he means Aegon, their son, and that he should sit on the Iron Throne. This, of course, leads to Alicent being motivated by that misunderstanding to usurp the throne from Rhaenyra, and not because she is power-hungry or holds a grudge against Rhaenyra, which, again, would be simpler and more engaging motivations. Likewise, in the last episode, Lucerys is killed by Aemon and Vhagar, but to everyone's surprise, it was an accident. Aemon only wanted to scare Lucerys, apparently, even though he had just ordered Luke to cut out his own eye in the main hall of Storm's End and was chasing him in the middle of a storm with the biggest nuclear weapon known in this world. Now, this one hurts, because Lucerys' death being an accident is actually not a bad idea on paper. It is a severe escalation of the conflict, even in the book, and it was set up in the show by Viserys that the control the Targaryens have over the dragons is a mere illusion, and that's represented perfectly in this scene. I actually can believe that maybe Aemon, knowing the consequences of killing Luke, would not want to actually kill him. But given all the softening of the characters the show had already gone through earlier in the season, and the other misunderstandings that changed everything in the previous episode, to do those things here again just feels like a way for the writers to pull their punches and not allow these moments to land with full weight and intention. I get that the writers want to instill the notion that these characters are not inherently good or evil. Aemon, Alicent, Rhaenyra, Daemon, they're just people. Accidents and chance events play a big part in real life after all, and that's a big element in George's stories. But these two events are keystone moments that shape the story forever afterwards, and to make them both based on mistakes and misunderstandings, besides the whole prophecy thing, diminishes the whole conflict, because it's not about how human beings are flawed, twisted, callous, and sometimes very wicked creatures, but it's instead about how sometimes we just don't talk things out, when everything could be easily explained and resolved as if we're in a romantic comedy. Misunderstandings and prophetic portents are both symptoms of this show's inclination towards softening these characters in the eyes of the audience. Again, I understand this. These are our protagonists. From a TV show perspective, it makes sense to try to make them minimally likable. But these narrative devices soften the characters at the expense of taking their agency away. I don't have a solution for this problem, so I don't want to be too critical, but I wish that they had come up with better ways of doing it. Or, if they were going to play these cards, that they only played them once. In the book, it's pretty clear to all the characters that things could be talked out, that there are ways out of this catastrophic conflict. These characters could make peace, but they choose not to. It's the why they choose not to that's the interesting question to look into. If the answer is simply because prophecy, or because they misunderstood, or because an accident happened, then really nothing is being said about the human heart at conflict with itself. Another big hurdle for this show has been balancing having iconic, impactful moments with the established logical context of this world. The biggest example of this is with Criston Cole, who brutally murders a highborn guest of the future king consort at a royal wedding in front of everyone and is not even fired from the king's guard. Could the writers honestly not come up with a more subtle way of showing the audience Cole's violent, impulsive nature? It's jarring enough by itself, but it's made even worse when in the very next episode, Harwin Strong only punches Cole and is fired from the City Watch for it. And Alicent vouching for Criston Cole off-screen is not a good enough excuse, because Harwin's dad is the hand of the king. He could hold just as much sway as Alicent, given that this was a mere punch, not a murder. This happens again when Alicent charges at Rhaenyra with a dagger and holds it pretty much at her face and no one intervenes. They just form a circle around them. There are a number of Kingsguard in the room, as well as Daemon, who just had sex with Rhaenyra, and yet no one grabs Alicent, or her arm, or the knife. Highborn knights indiscriminately murder each other left and right in the tourney in the first episode to cheers from the audience, and no one questions it, as if we're in a Dothraki wedding.
Dothraki wedding without at least 3 deaths is considered a dull affair.
Rhaenys is given the badass moment of crashing the crowning of Aegon to threaten the High Towers with her dragon, but she does this while murdering several dozens of innocent bystanders, who just happen to be at the scene. I understand that the writers want to arrange for these dramatic moments to occur, but they neglect the ways in which these events come across as totally unbelievable, which makes them not land dramatically as they should, instead being just totally immersion breaking. Finally, I have to bring up the structure of the show itself, as it might be the root cause of many of the issues I've mentioned, and of others as well. Like I said, portraying 20 years in 10 episodes is a grueling task narratively, and despite my complaints, some of which I know are nitpicks, it could have been handled a lot worse. The fact that the end result is satisfying despite its flaws is impressive. The first 4 episodes are handled with relative ease, and mostly serve to establish character relationships, future conflicts, and the overall feel for the world. In certain episodes, it might even feel like not much is happening, but in terms of characterization, this is actually the strongest part of the show. Episodes 5, 6, and 7, though, are in my opinion the low point of the season, which are, coincidentally, the episodes around the major time jumps. Episode 5 has to severely escalate the tension between Alicent and Rhaenyra in a way that feels a little rushed, given that the show started with them being best friends, and the same goes for Criston Cole. Episodes 6 and 7 have to handle the change in attitude due to the cast switches, but also attempt at portraying how characters feel about all kinds of different issues after 10 years of being off screen. Just to illustrate, these 2 episodes have to handle the relationship between Rhaenyra and Harwin Strong, Rhaenyra and Laenor, Daemon and Laena, the killing of Laena and Harwin Strong, getting rid of Laenor, introducing all of the grown-up children, blinding Aemond, establishing Vhagar's importance, and marrying Daemon and Rhaenyra, all the while developing existing relationships with other characters like Otto and Viserys, and just on the cusp of another 6-year time jump into episode 8. It's no surprise that much of this feels rushed, especially in the case of Alicent, who goes from Rhaenyra's best friend to having some issues with her, all the way to seeing her as a downright mortal enemy by episode 6, over mostly frivolous matters. Their reconciliation in episode 8 actually feels kind of fitting, because we as the audience don't understand why Alicent would hate Rhaenyra this much. But then the plot forces the show to use the tacked-on misunderstanding with the prophecy to break them apart again. It's just not very well developed, despite the incredible acting. Episodes 8, 9, and 10 managed to stick the landing nicely, mostly because of the strength of episode 8 throughout, which is probably the season's best episode, and because of the exciting escalation of the conflict in the last 2 episodes. Episode 10 specifically works well as an episode, but poorly as a finale, because it provides only the mirror perspective to episode 9, rather than a global concluding outlook of the characters going forward. I hope I'm not giving the impression that I didn't like the show, because the truth is far from that. I watched this show with a smile on my face, eagerly awaiting the next episode. I was immediately hooked by the characters in the pilot, and judging by the response of viewers unfamiliar with the source material, it was widespread among the audience. The reintroduction to this world was executed properly, the plots in each episode were all engaging, and I never felt bored watching it. There are several moments that really impressed me for their execution, like Aemaren's birth scene in the pilot, the connection between Rhaenyra and Daemon, which I actually found to be well established despite Daemon's inconsistencies, and of course Viserys' walk to the throne in episode 8, which is probably the best scene of the season. The story and the characters take stumbles here and there, but in the end you feel connected to what's going on, because these characters are made to be compelling to watch, and we are invested in the world and in what happens to them in the future. Not all fantasy shows pull this off, even those with established worlds in pop culture. So, despite its flaws, House of the Dragon scratched my fantasy itch in a satisfying way. My problems with it are my own, and you're free to agree, disagree, maybe even claim my complaints were only due to my connection with the source material, which is entirely possible. Nevertheless, I hope you enjoyed listening to my thoughts and my rants, and I thank you for stopping by. See you in Season 2!